Okay, we'll get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. And we're so pleased to have with us this evening former National Security Council official, Fiona Hill, here to talk with journalist Susan Glasser about Fiona's new book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of There Is Nothing for You Here. For many of us who watched the first impeachment of Donald Trump in late 2019, the scene of Fiona testifying provided an indelible image. Calm, direct, authoritative, she delivered what amounted to a short lecture on the realities of Russian interference in the 2016 election, Russia's goal of weakening the United States, and the harm being done by false Republican narratives and furthering Kremlin aims. The New Yorker, in an account of Fiona's testimony, noted her steely self-confidence and moral earnestness. Her message, the article said, couldn't have come through more clearly. Fiona has spent a 30-year career establishing herself as a policy expert on Russia and moving out and back twice between academia and government. After growing up poor in Northeast England, the daughter of a coal miner, she came to Harvard and got a PhD in history, then held a number of positions in the 1990s, directing technical assistance and research projects at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Next, she joined the Brookings Institution as a senior fellow. She became an American citizen in 2002, and in 2006 entered the Bush administration as a senior expert on Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She stayed into the first year of the Obama administration and went back to Brookings, where she co-wrote a book, a sort of psychological portrait about Vladimir Putin that was published in 2013. In 2017, she joined the Trump administration as senior director for European and Russian affairs at the National Security Council. Now she's again at Brookings as a senior fellow. Her new book, as part memoir, is engaging and very well told, but it's more than just an account of her own impressive life. Fiona weaves her story of upward mobility with events and issues she's observed and studied during her career. She delivers a stern warning, persuasively arguing that America may be headed where Russia already has gone in the past 2 decades, away from democracy and toward autocracy, unless our nation addresses crucial challenges, especially in education, healthcare, and job opportunities. A conversation with Fiona, as I mentioned at the outset, will be Susan Glasser, who writes a weekly column on life in Washington for The New Yorker, and also appears on CNN as a global affairs analyst. In previous assignments, Susan served as a top editor of Political, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post. And she and her journalist husband, Peter Baker, spent a tour in Moscow as co-bureau chiefs in the early 2000s. Out of that joint experience, they co-authored a book about the early years of Putin's rule of Russia. Last fall, they came out with an excellent biography of former power broker James Baker called The Man Who Ran Washington. And they're both currently working on a book about Trump. So Fiona and Susan, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Brad, and to everyone at the Politics and Prose family. And to Fiona, congratulations on the book. There's Nothing for You Here. I will say it is a terrific read. And I think it's very fitting, actually, that we're having this conversation today on the 69th birthday of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, which is the subject that originally brought us together more than 2 decades ago, because that's how long Fiona and I have known each other. And I think it's fair to say that neither one of us could ever anticipated the kinds of conversations we'd have been having the last few years, not about Russia, but about the United States. And the book, as Brad said, is really a meditation on that and so many other things about how we all got to where we are right now. So Fiona, again, congratulations on the book. And I guess let's just jump right in. Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, you were the only woman in the room in Helsinki. Tell us what your conclusion is after all this time. I mean, we're still unraveling the mystery of what the president of the United States, why he had what you call autocrat envy of the president of Russia. How was this possible?
Well, thanks very much, Susan. It's really great to be here with you. And actually, you and I overlapped, as you and I know, obviously, very early on in our careers as well at Harvard, when I first came to the United States and you were just finishing up there, before we then met again our professional lives, both covering Putin's Russia. And Brad, thank you so much, and to everyone at Politics and Prose for hosting me tonight, and for previously having my book on Mr. Putin in your shelves, back in the day. And the whole experience of being at Helsinki, I recounted in the past. I just want to actually, for the record, clarify that I wasn't the only woman in the room. It was probably just the most notable woman in the room because of the way that some of the photos were for the expanded meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin, their teams, because there was, of course, our US State Department interpreter, who is a woman. And, as in the role of interpreters, they are very much, behind the scenes, very discreetly there. But that also meant that President Trump was never alone with President Putin, as people speculated at the time in Helsinki. He had the interpreter there. I mean, again, a professional who has probably met with Vladimir Putin more times than anyone else, to be honest, as the main interpreter for all of these interactions with Putin in the time that he's been in office, which by this point has been 21 years. And as you said, he's 69. Next birthday, he's going to be 70. And he's actually been telling us that he might want to stay around in power until he's 84 in 2036. So this is a banner day for him, just the beginning of yet another long period of us with him. But, that experience in Helsinki, was one of those, dreadful moments, I think, for not just me personally and others, sitting there in the room, watching everything unfold at the press conference later, but also for America as well. I mean, this was a national humiliation, seeing the press conference. The actual meetings beforehand at that expanded cabinet meeting level between Trump and Putin, with people sitting around the table over a lunch, was fairly straightforward and, remarkably normal under, these kinds of circumstances. And in fact, the meeting between Trump and Putin had been very much focused on arms control and starting off a series of exchanges between the National Security Council in the US and their counterparts in Russia. There'd been some abnormal elements. Putin, like he usually did, tried to pull a fast one, the kind of thing that you wrote about in your book, Kremlin Rising, about, the dirty tricks department of the Kremlin, and how Putin was pretty good at pulling something out of a hat and, trying to manipulate the situation. And just before we'd got to Helsinki, the FBI had made a shot across the Russian intelligence community's bows by basically saying that they wanted to indict several Russian operatives for what they had done in the 2016 election for interference operations. And Putin was very quick to pick on this and shoot right back by suggesting to Trump, who had no idea what Putin was talking about, but the interpreter did, the translator, American translator, that perhaps the US and Russia could avail themselves of a mutual legal assistance treaty. And perhaps if the United States and the FBI wanted to interview these Russian operatives, well, maybe Russia might be able to interview a few people as well. Now, of course, they didn't have in mind any intelligence operatives. They were thinking of people like our ambassador, Michael McFaul, who happened to be there, a businessman, former US citizen, but now a British citizen, Bill Browder, and a host of other people that you and I, Susan, know, many of whom are in the government or on Capitol Hill, who had been involved in the Magnitsky Bill, which was pushing back against US human rights, Russian human rights abuses, and applying US sanctions to Russia in the wake of this bill. And Putin had been waiting a long time to get some vengeance on this. So in that meeting, he kind of throws this out for Putin. Putin throws it out for Trump. And Trump, not knowing what this is, but hearing the sound of the US might get to interview some people, says, yeah, great idea. Thinks that this will be, something that he might be able to work with. And then from there, things kind of barrel on into the embarrassment that we saw at the Helsinki press conference, because that immediately is picked up on. We know that's going to be a problem. But then the press conference itself becomes an even bigger problem.
Well, that's right. And that's one of those great scenes of, like humanity in the book, Fiona, where you're like, Oh my God, what should I do? I think you even contemplated, like fainting or something to try to disrupt this sort of slow motion car crash of a press conference.
Yeah, because I was sitting right behind the front row of senior US officials, the national security advisor, our ambassador to Russia, the Secretary of State, and right in front of all of the journalists. And in fact, I was just in front of the journalists who were questioning Trump, as you can imagine, with a great deal of energy, and asking him whether he'd asked Vladimir Putin about what he'd done in the elections. And would Trump, admit in front of all of the people present and also the world watching this on a live press conference that the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election. Of course, Trump didn't want to do that, and he turned himself into all kinds of knots, trying to avoid the question, trying to deflect it, but essentially saying words to the effect, quite clearly, that he took Putin's word that they hadn't interfered over the word of his own intelligence services. And of course, as I'm hearing this unfold, I'd actually thought that the press conference was a terrible idea. Putin was always extraordinarily adept at turning things to his advantage, as you know, and as anybody else who's watched him, he's very clever in the moment of this. President Trump is not the best at press conferences. Once he got past his prepared statement, it was just a free-for-all. He was deeply insecure about being asked the question about what had happened in 2016 because he didn't want people suggesting he was illegitimate in any way. And he didn't want to be shown up against on the world stage in front of Putin.
And what happened when you said? What happened when you said no? We don't want to have this press conference.
Oh, it was immediately disregarded. I mean, of course, that President Trump would have a press conference. It's what he does. He wants to have the big show on the world stage. And as I said, I thought about how can I end it? Is there a fire alarm? Looking around the room. Can I just fall over backwards? And of course, that would have just made even more of a spectacle. It would have had no impact whatsoever. Just more fodder for the very humiliating situation for the United States and for everyone else present.
Well, now President Trump, former President Trump, has endorsed your book with a remarkable statement that he put out yesterday. He says that you were both terrible at your job, but also that he doesn't remember you, which I think is perfect. He also says you were a deep state stiff, but with a very nice accent. Your book recounts a kind of remarkable experience for a senior policy aide on the National Security Council, where the President of the United States, the first time you met him in the Oval Office, I believe he confused you for a secretary and called you darling. The second time you met him, according to the book, you were in the room while he was signing a NATO accession treaty with Montenegro, and he asked you, how am I going to get along with Vladimir Putin? He's a very nice man. And it went on from there. So, Fiona, the one critical note in this otherwise kind of very deservedly, rapturous praise for your book has been the question of why did you go work for this man in the first place? It was not a secret that Trump was like this. And I remember our conversations a little bit back in January and February of 2017. Why?
Yeah, well, I did talk to you about this, but the why for me was fairly straightforward. I mean, first of all, I'd already served under two previous presidents, under Bush and Obama, as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia. So I knew what the Russians were up to. And in the wake of that public service, which it was a non-partisan, non-political position, I'd gone on to work on the book about Putin, Mr. Putin operative in the Kremlin. This is the same period that you were, writing your book as well about the whole rise of Putin and the move away from democracy in Russia towards autocracy. And I knew a lot about, what was happening behind the scenes. And I didn't know all of the details, of course, but the Russian effort to interfere in the 2016 election. And I have to say that I saw it across the board from my vantage point at the Brookings Institution, still having a lot of interactions with Russians and many others. I could see already, without having any access to classified information, that the Russians were trying to infiltrate all of the campaigns. And I'd written quite a bit in the run-up, to the election about what I thought the Russians were doing, why they might want to interfere. And there were many of my former colleagues from the directors, the DNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, who ended up going in as detailees and some political appointees into the Trump administration. And they reached out to me, along with some others on the campaign who knew me from my work on Putin, and asked me if I would come in. So I didn't seek this out. And look, I saw this as public service and serving the country. And I think even the way that we frame things about an individual person's presidency and administration shows the problems that we're actually facing right now. Of course, this is that particular president's administration, but it's also supposed to be him himself serving the country. Your service is to the country, not to an individual. When you take an oath of office as a public servant, you're taking an oath to the Constitution. And I'd already taken an oath as a citizen of the United States because I'm obviously an immigrant. And I became a citizen in 2002, and I had to take an oath then to the Constitution. And, I took all of that very seriously. So I didn't see myself as there serving him. I was there to try to work with others behind the scenes to try to see what we could do to mitigate the fallout from this sophisticated Russian operation to influence the presidency. And also knowing that Trump himself and many of the team around him had been pretty naive about Russia. And in fact, they'd been more than naive, as we find out later. They'd been actively interested in using information that came their way from WikiLeaks, and we know that a lot of that was coming from Russian sources. And so I was extremely worried about the Russia aspect of things, and that was kind of what I was focused on. But of course, as time went on in the administration, I became much more worried about the United States. And the Russians didn't invent any of the problems that they were exploiting. They were taking advantage of weakness and division and, the vulnerabilities of people like Trump and the susceptibilities to political manipulation in our public opinion, through social media and all the other kinds of things that, we know so much about now.
So was there a moment for you where you understood that, you weren't ever going to get a chance to explain to Donald Trump just what needed to be done on Russia policy, where you understood that, the premise of working in some sort of nonpartisan, bipartisan way was not possible in this White House?
Yeah, that second part came a bit later, but the idea that I was going to sit down with Trump and do the Putin brief that I'd actually done, before for both Bush and for Obama, that was obviously it wasn't going to happen pretty much from the get-go. I mean, those stories that you related there, when he thinks I'm the secretary, because of course, one of the jobs of a senior director is to take notes. But that immediate idea that I was the secretary and that I was there to take notes, not that I was any kind of expert on Russia. But when I was introduced as the the Russia advisor, because I also covered Europe at the National Security Council, it wasn't just Russia. He didn't even really look up at me, as you relate. He actually, the only thing he asked me was, was he going to like Putin? And he basically made a point of telling me that Rex did Russia for him. Rex being Secretary Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, who happened to be sitting in the Oval Office at that particular juncture. And, that in itself was already a, who are you? I don't know anything about you. Okay, so people are telling me you're the Russia expert. It fits with the job review, performance review that I've just got from him, in his statement a couple of years late. Basically, I don't know this person. Why do I need to know this person? I've got Rex. But even Secretary Tillerson wasn't really treated with any kind of great respect, as we know, from the course of his tenure as Secretary of State. As CEO of ExxonMobil, Trump would have probably paid much more attention to him and what he had to say about Vladimir Putin than he did as Secretary of State, because in Trump's view, and he was Secretary of State, everyone is essentially a secretary. They're the staff. They're the people who he informs about what to do, not who inform him of, what's probably the best course of action.
So, a lot of people had different rationales. Some, like you, came in to serve the country or were particularly concerned about their policy area when you had such a president who was a newcomer or unfamiliar with the issues. They all found different versions of the same story at the end, which is they either were fired or had to quit or, found themselves put into uncomfortable or impossible positions. And, one of, I think, the enduring questions for historians will be like, well, was it worth it? There are some people clearly, like former Secretary Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, or Tillerson, John Bolton, even to a certain extent, who you worked for. They all seem to think by the end that their job actually was to constrain the president of the United States, to make sure that bad things didn't happen, or to limit them to the best of their abilities. What can you tell us about that choice between, were they right? I mean, you think about something like January 6th or the impeachment that we'll talk about, and did it make a difference to have people like that there, or really, you know, what's the point of enabling and working for someone like Trump?
Well, you've just said that, you know, many of them thought that they were constraining things rather than enabling things. I mean, there were definitely people there who were enabling. And there still remain people around President Trump, including lots of members of Congress and the former, you know, Vice President Pence and others who are still enabling President Trump by perpetrating the lies that he's told about, you know, being elected and re-elected as president in 2020, and, you know, telling everyone that Joe Biden was not elected, and talking about the stealing of the election, and talking about, you know, nothing happening on January 6th. There was a group of tourists or political martyrs, you know, who are being persecuted by the press, you know, instead of a mob that he riled up that went to storm the Capitol on January 6th. But look, I want to say that behind the scenes, you know, we had still all of the political appointees, you know, that have come out, you know, many of them have talked about the book, you know, many of these people really were standing up for, you know, trying to push forward with coherent US policies. They were, you know, trying to do, you know, for some of them, similar jobs that they'd done in previous administrations. A lot of people who'd worked initially in the Bush administration who took a risk, you know, and coming back knowing full well that this would be very difficult. You know, a lot of scrutiny comes on, you know, the people that people know about the best, but there were people in the Treasury Department still doing the kinds of things that people in the Treasury Department did. At the Department of Justice, we're finding out more information now in this investigation about January 6th about how people really work to contain and constrain and push back against efforts to pervert the rule of law in the United States. And there were also a lot of detailees from across the government, the permanent employees of the US government, who were detailed into the National Security Council and to elsewhere at the, you know, higher levels of government in the executive branches, who were doing their jobs. And behind the scenes on, you know, a lot of the not so hot button issues, I think there was a lot of positive things that were done that, you know, people may never hear about, but, you know, maybe some historians, you know, will find this, you know, later on. And I think it was worth that effort. And it's always worth the effort of trying to serve your country in some capacity. A lot of the people I worked with were military veterans. So they had, you know, we can be asking the same questions about, you know, was it sensible for them as military veterans to go to war in Afghanistan and to Iraq? I mean, we're having a big debate now about the forever wars, but these were people who served their country. They put their lives on the line. Many of them had been injured. A lot of them, you know, had been decorated for great valor. You know, many of the people I worked side by side in my own department, that was the case. And they thought it was really important to step up in a time of extremis to do something. So I found that, you know, really encouraging, you know, to be part of a group of people who were basically saying, look, our country's going through some difficult times here. General Mattis said that quite openly at one point to the Pentagon staff. And we have to kind of, you know, try to keep a steady state here. It wasn't necessarily enabling, you know, as the accusation has been. And, you know, as I said, I can't always tell people exactly what happened behind the scenes because it wouldn't be appropriate to, you know, lay all of that out there.
One of the moments, right, which you recount in the book and which, you know, was really a pretty searing personal experience for you is that your introduction, you know, to the brutal politics surrounding this administration. You go in, you're working a few months, and I believe it's as early as May of 2017, both you and H.R. McMaster, General McMaster, who at that time is your boss, the national security advisor, are immediately sort of the subject of this almost this sort of coordinated smear campaign and this propaganda campaign where you're accused of being, you know, deep state, George Soros, globalist moles. Breitbart is attacking you. Roger Stone and Alex Jones are attacking you. You saw the full disinformation, misinformation campaign, not only used in context of Russia and the election, but literally on you yourself. What was it like to be in the middle of that?
Well, that was a bit of a shock at first, you know, because I'd not really kind of expected it to come from domestic US quarters. Although it turned out that there was a foreign hand behind this, but it wasn't who I thought it would be. You know, I thought the Russians, you know, who've known me for a long time, and I've been the subject of many conspiracy theories before. There's loads of them still on the internet. You know, I read these and I think, my God, how have I got the time and the energy to do some of these things? How can I possibly be in all these places at once? And, you know, as a national intelligence officer, there was, you know, quite a lot of effort made to discredit me anyway. So, you know, I've been there and done that. But this had this, you know, a rather prosaic and very strange origin, as I lay out in the book. It turns out that a lobbyist, the former US congressman, who had been taken on by the Hungarian government to ensure that Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, would get an early visit with Trump in the White House, had decided that I was somehow blocking it when the meeting didn't happen, when Orban was not one of the first people to be invited to the White House. Well, it really had nothing to do with me, and I'd only just started there. But they got hold of my CV, which of course was public. They filed a Foreign Agent Registration Act document. This is a filing system for lobbyists that was set up, under a law that was passed during World War II to prevent Nazi, Germans from infiltrating US politics. It's somewhat archaic, and it isn't really very clearly scrutinized, but you can find the documentation of what people intend to do there. And they looked down my resume and found that I and Brookings and Harvard and all the places I'd been affiliated with had affiliations with George Soros's Open Society network. I'd been on the board of the American University in Central Asia, so they kind of put all of this together and decided that I was the obstacle to Viktor Orban getting into the White House. And so they were going to go after me. And I was, accused of going after the president, going after the entire people of Hungary. And, I ended up, as you said, on InfoWars, and I got death threats, and I had, people on the internet, hundreds and hundreds of derogatory comments threatening violence against me and my family. And I mean, this was really fairly astounding. But it was also fascinating, if you stood back from it, which, initially was a bit hard, but I'm not on the internet, so I was, kind of getting told this by, lots of other friends and family members who were documenting it for me. And it was really, as you said, this is the kind of way that conspiracy theories and these defamation attacks took place in the Soviet Union and in Russia. In the Stalin era, people would denounce people who weren't even their enemies. They might just, wanted something, perhaps not getting Viktor Orban into the White House, but, maybe they wanted their neighbor's apartment. They might even wanted their neighbor's wife or their neighbor's wife's fur coat. I mean, we've got all of this evidence from, the files from the Stalin era. And so they wrote in a denunciation to the equivalent of the Roger Stones and Alex Jones, who were working at that point in the KGB. And the neighbor ends up being marched away in the night, off to the Gulag. So, we used to think, you and I and others looking at all of this, and my goodness, kind of, what was that actually like? Well, hey, I got the firsthand experience of what this was like. And I also understood how these conspiracy theories take hold, because it turned out that the whole conspiracy theory about George Soros was manufactured for political purposes to help Viktor Orban in Hungary get elected and re-elected and elected again as prime minister. And the people who helped him to devise this were actually a bunch of political operatives from New York. And they realized he needed a kind of an enemy, a convenient enemy to mobilize against. And they came up with George Soros because his family had fled Hungary, during the Holocaust period. He'd at one point had even given a grant to Viktor Orban to, further his studies. And now the whole story was that he turned against Orban. He was trying to rule Hungary from the United States. And so this was all just a manufactured conspiracy, like so many others that we've seen in history, particularly in the Soviet Union. And it was just incredible to watch this in real time and to be part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. But it was a real eye-opener.
Well, and the thing you just pointed out about Orban, I think, is really this profound experience that you had of realizing that these tactics that we'd read about in Soviet history had come into the United States and into the US government and into the White House itself. And so now you have the fusion and the transference of this sort of anti-Semitic trope about George Soros, which has been used to divide Hungarian society, been used to weaken Hungarian democracy, now is come into the United States and being used to weaken American democracy by a lobbyist, a Republican lobbyist who wants to influence the president of the United States. That's the part that I find remarkable. And you write, I think, really in a compelling way about what you call Donald Trump's autocrat envy, which is to say, looking not just at Vladimir Putin, but people like Viktor Orban as well. Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, was another favorite. You say that Trump called him the Sultan. why was Donald Trump so obsessed, in your view, or admiring of these autocrats? Previous presidents might have had to deal with them. We certainly, the United States, worked closely many times with less than democratic leaders around the world, especially in the Cold War. But I don't think we've ever had a president who so palpably admired these autocrats. What was that like, seeing that from the inside of the White House?
Well, of course, it was really disturbing because it was all about their style and their approach. He wanted to be them and he wanted to rule like them. And this isn't just, a conclusion that I drew. It's things that actually people very close to him said. So the US ambassador to Hungary, who had been very close to Donald Trump, known him for decades in New York, and was, a friend of his, he actually said outright, not just to me, but to journalists, journalist Frankenfour from the Atlantic in an interview, that, basically Donald Trump wanted to rule like Viktor Orban. He wanted to have that raw power that he saw. He didn't want to have the checks and the balances. He wanted to do whatever he wanted to do, and he didn't want anyone to be telling him no. So this was pretty astounding. Many people who knew quite a bit about Trump before he got to the White House might have said, well, yes, again, like the ambassador said, this is pretty typical of him. That's why he has his own company. He doesn't want to be in business with other people. He wants to do things all of himself. But he was basically projecting that personalization of his company, as of course his own company, onto the United States, and personalizing the power in the United States as well, and trying to privatize it. And the fact that he was more like Viktor Orban or a Vladimir Putin or a President Erdogan of Turkey than he was like his predecessors, American presidents, I think should give people a lot of pause. I mean, he wanted to be them, he wanted to rule like them, and he wanted to be able to stay in power indefinitely like them, and also by using conspiracies and lies, which is what Viktor Orban has been doing in Hungary. So
does that mean that you think that that's an explanation for what we saw at the end of Trump's presidency with the election denial and the effort to stay in power and January 6th? Do you think that he was a president for whom the Constitution really was irrelevant?
Sure. I don't know whether he's ever read the Constitution or other, taken in the import of it. For him, he already said that he thought that the Constitution, at least as he understood it in vague terms, allowed him as the president to have unchecked power. I mean, remember during the campaign, he actually said, I can get away with anything, including, potentially shooting someone in Fifth Avenue. And he thought as president that everyone worked for him. Remember, the period in which there was the great effort by the Republican Congress and Senate to have judges placed, across all of the major court systems and in the Supreme Court. Trump called them his judges. He called everyone his generals. I mean, everyone was his staff. Everyone was working for him. And look, and I'm sorry, the media and everybody always plays into this, because this whole framing of him, his administration, the fixation on him as the president. The preamble of the Constitution begins with "we, the people." And I weave this into some of the chapters because he's me, the people. Me. It's not we, it's me. And at no point did I hear him talk about anyone else other than himself. And if there was a third person, it was him. They're talking about himself in the third person.
Well,
and I'm observing all of this at close hand because, as we know, he didn't pay any attention to me. He didn't know who I was. But, when you're there and people aren't paying any attention to you, you have an awful lot of time to sit back and observe. And I'd already had a lot of opportunity to observe similar populist leaders and autocrats and authoritarian figures up close as well. And I saw him interact with them. And it was unmistakable, the way that he looked at them and thought about basically his own presidency in their terms, not in the terms of the American Constitution or the terms of his predecessors.
Fiona, you make another comparison between Trump and the autocrats in your book that I think is really on the mark. And it brings us, of course, to your starring role in the impeachment. And that is the fusion between a sort of crony capitalism and the kind of right-wing populism. And that is an attribute that you've seen in all the countries where this kind of resurgence or the diminution of democracy has been taking place. And it's something that Trump had in common with them. That comes very clearly through in the transcript of the perfect phone call, as he termed it, with the Ukrainian president Zelensky. What did you mean by that? I mean, do you think that Donald Trump, this was a, a sort of a crooked deal, or that this is just how he talked, or, what, was that consistent, that phone call? Was that consistent with the other kinds of interactions he had with world leaders? You listened to a number of those calls and were in meetings with Donald Trump when he met with world leaders. You also read the transcripts of many of Trump's interactions, even that you didn't participate in. Did he talk to other world leaders like that?
No, it was never quite as direct as that. I mean, I have to be very careful about, what I say about these calls, but that one was quite shocking to me, actually, because he was usually skirting around things, hinting, by inference, and sometimes they didn't pick up on it. With the Brits, for example, he'd constantly veer off to talk about Turnberry, his golf course one of his golf courses in Scotland, and, make clear hints that, kind of, this was, the pride of his collection of golf courses, kind of, there's been reporting about him wanting to see if he could encourage the British Open to go there. He was always, kind of dropping that in, but in a more, not quite subtle way, but a way in which he was kind of more ambiguous about what he meant. So that phone call to me was a real break. I thought to myself, wow, he's just all, kind of pretenses off here now. Will you do me a favor, or do me a favor? That kind of language. He was just getting right to the chase. I mean, it was clear by the time that I left the National Security Council, which was just before that phone call, that, things were really heating up, and that Ukraine and policy toward Ukraine was being used and manipulated for domestic political purposes. But I didn't fully appreciate it until I saw the transcript of the call, like everybody else did at the same time in the newspaper. And then as I find myself in all of the hearings, actually the first hearing was about, kind of almost exactly 2 years ago that I took part in October the 14th, when I start to really fully fathom about how much there was an orchestration with Trump at the center of it, about all these machinations around Ukraine to get Ukrainian government and Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, to declare investigations into corruption targeted at Hunter Biden, Vice President Joe Biden's son, and then also former Vice President Joe Biden's son, of course, at that point, and Biden himself, who was already, as Trump surmised, going to be the main candidate, the main competitor for the presidential election in 2020. When, kind of I'd left, there was all these little bits of information floating around for me, and I was trying to put all the pieces together. I was warning colleagues. I was, kind of putting the alarms. I was only really with a phone call that this all came into crystal clear view. I was shocked by that phone call.
Because you had a lot of like little bits and pieces of information, that started actually earlier than many people may realize. Back when Marie Yovanovitch, the ambassador to Ukraine, was fired, this was well known in the small circle of people who follow Russia and Ukraine in Washington. But you were like, why is Rudy Giuliani, why is Donald Trump Jr. tweeting about Masha Yovanovitch, right? That was probably one of the early, what is going on here signs for you.
Yeah, there was a number, and I do relate, some of them in the book. We, and I talked about them at the testimony and in the depositions, that we got these strange phone calls, very similar to what, I'd had, even mentioning George Soros. And at first I thought, oh, here we go again. And then I thought, well, why is she being targeted? And, initially I assumed, and I still think that was, probably part of it as well, that, these associates of Rudy Giuliani, both have been under investigation and, actually had some cases brought against them. Ukrainian Americans, Fruman and Parnas, had been, finding the ambassador an obstacle to some business dealings that they wanted to do in Kiev. And, obviously a lot of people had axe to grind against her because she was promoting the cleaning up of basically Ukrainian politics and the economy. The United States Embassy in Kiev was basically pushing out a lot of programs on anti-corruption and, good governance. And so, they would have associated her with these and seemed to want to get her out of the way. And Rudy Giuliani seemed to be talking about her, as you say, with surprising frequency. But it was only really when she was sacked in May of that year. That was also quite shocking to her and shocking to everyone else, because we assumed that this had all been dealt with behind the scenes. And I'd gone to Ambassador Bolton, my immediate boss and national security advisor. And clearly there were a lot of people trying to stop this from happening. And Ambassador Bolton had said to me, as I said, I suppose rather memorably during the testimony, that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up. And, it was clear that, something was going on. And he said, initially, I assumed that it was these guys, pushing their own agenda, perhaps trying to rope the president in. But by the phone call, of course, it's inescapable that this is Trump himself. And all of the pieces came together in the hearings and in the, all the depositions. I mean, I, had that revelation in the moment that, so some people around Trump, some of the people that I was interacting with, they weren't even doing foreign policy and national security policy. It wasn't just, it was a domestic political errand. It was a personal, private mission for Donald Trump himself to keep him in power, for him to win the election and discredit the person who was most likely to be his main competitor.
What a chilling moment to, have those pieces all come together for you. Now, I want to flag, by the way, for the audience, we are going to try to do some questions. So please, if you can, before we run out of time, get your questions in the Q&A button on the Zoom, if you can, and we'll try to get through as many of those. But Fiona, I want to bring us back to that moment 2 years ago. I didn't realize it was almost exactly 2 years ago, because that's the inspiration for this book in some ways is, you wrote this opening statement for your testimony and, you brought yourself into it, which is something that Brookings think tank analysts are not known for doing. It's certainly something that national intelligence officers are not known for doing. And I think that's part of what made your story resonate with people when you told it in public, was this idea that you could speak not only to what you saw behind the scenes in the Trump administration when it connected with Russia and Ukraine and the president, but that you could also speak in some ways to how we got to this place as a democracy and as a society. And as you pointed out, there was also a lot of veterans, a lot of immigrants who also came forward, including Alex Vindman in your office is the obvious, but not the only example. What was it like to tell your personal story for the first time? Because that's something that's really different for you. And I have to say, it's a great book, but folks, Fiona is definitely not used to selling herself. There's no picture of her on the cover of this book, unlike on the cover of all these other memoirs that you're reading. That is certainly the only Trump White House memoir that includes an entire section of policy recommendations on how we can make the country a better place. So, obviously you told your story, but you weren't fully reconciled to this kind of confessional culture.
No, and I mean, look, as you said, in all the other previous positions, you just don't put yourself in it because, where's the objectivity of that then? But, the people who were questioning me and my colleagues, who were brought forward as fact witnesses, we were subpoenaed, we weren't there for one side or the other, they were questioning our integrity. They were, the presidents just called me again, the former president, a deep state stiff, albeit with a nice accent. They were calling us deep state coup plotters. They were basically saying we were part of some clique, a conspiracy of our own, behind the scenes, that we weren't representative of America, that we were disloyal. And, that got my backup, in those meetings, and also just all the attacks of my colleagues. I mean, people like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, Ambassador Maria Yovanovitch, all these people whose names, their reputations are being dragged through the mud. I'd seen Trump be incredibly rude to General McMaster, a hero of America, a highly decorated war veteran who'd put his life on the line. And, I thought to myself, what is going on here? And also, here's President Trump, the son of incredible privilege, basically saying, I know better than anyone else what it's like to be working class, blue collar, the kind of the forgotten people in the United States. And I knew that many of the people I worked with in government were just exactly that. They were the people who joined the military on Main Street, USA, from across the entire country, and then, wanted to serve the country. They were, kind of people from all kinds of backgrounds who are in the federal government, because the Postal Service, the military, these are all part of it, the Park Service. A lot of people, doing things that, make people's lives in America a lot better. And they were trying to do this out of a spirit of public service. And they're ordinary people. They look like America. And they're the children, like I was, of coal miners, or they're immigrants, to the United States. And I'm both of those things. And so I thought, well, okay, you've kind of asked for it. I'm just going to basically say, not true, first of all, and this is who I am. And this is who all these other people are as well. And that, got a unexpected reaction. I just wanted to kind of put to bed this idea that I'm a deep state coup plotter, kind of has just somehow come out fully formed as either a Brookings scholar or some, kind of government functionary, and just say, I'm like, everybody else here. And in fact, I might know a thing or two about, some of these issues that people are struggling with. And from there, it became evident as I came away from all the testimonies and all the reaction that I got, that maybe I should tell this story a bit further, because I did understand how we'd got there. And I could actually see why Trump was so appealing and continues to be so appealing to an awful lot of people, in the United States today, to millions of people, why he still speaks to them.
Yeah, the title of your book, There's Nothing for You Here, is from your dad, actually, and what he told you when you were growing up in basically the British version of West Virginia coal country.
Exactly. And my dad actually wanted to emigrate to the United States in the 1960s. There were recruiting notices being sent around to County Durham, where I grew up, where all the mines were closing down, trying to bring, miners over to the functional equivalents in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. My dad looked into a couple of possibilities in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, including in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, in what's Carbon County, Pennsylvania. And it's the direct correlate of my home region. I write about this in the book. But if he had come, and then, we'd all been there as a family, he'd have lost his job there too, because the coal mines also closed down in the 70s and 80s. So we might have moved in the 60s, only to then, find ourselves without a livelihood then later on as well. And it was that kind of recognition. And the first time that I went to the Lehigh Valley into Carbon County, I was just shocked. I was like, yes, it's a kind of more beautiful, rugged version of the northeast of England. The County Durham is also, quite beautiful as well, but not like this. It's spectacular. The scenic gorge and all of these amazing, beautiful spots in the Lehigh Valley. But it's the same, and people are experiencing the same problems that we had. And in fact, there are many of my distant relatives probably here too, because people did move from Northern England and Ireland and Wales and Scotland to work in the Pennsylvania coal country.
So Fiona, let's turn to the questions, and actually I'll pick one to start that's related to this issue of, Trump country and Brexit country, if you will. And what about foreign policy? Because this is a really interesting question, I thought. Brian Marcus, who is one of the audience, said, thank you for your service and for writing the book. Turning from foreign policy, what can you say about your experience as an American encountering the disconnect between elites and the rest of our country? Do you consider rural poverty in America a national security threat?
I really do, Brian. Yes, I do. And, that's another reason of writing about this, because this disaffection, people being left behind, their hometowns, getting left behind, it becomes, really fodder, fuel for political grievances. And, I saw that in the north of England, in my hometown, my home region, for example. As I was growing up there and all the jobs disappeared, people did start to, not on a large scale, but people did start to find an affinity with, for example, far-right movements. The UK Independence Party is, one that people might have heard of, that, propelling the movement towards Brexit, to the decision to pull out of the European Union. They were, pretty well entrenched in my home. My hometown was also the site of white supremacists and the British National Party, and some of the leaders of that movement came from my hometown. They were the people who could feed on other people's disaffection and, propelling them, towards violence. And all of that also, leads to the ability of outside groups to manipulate. For anybody who's studied revolutions, and around the world, kind of going back in history, there's always these linkages between revolutionary cells in different countries. And, we saw in the United Kingdom, in the United States and elsewhere, white supremacist movements and militias, particularly using the internet, going online and, basically coordinating with each other. And it's this kind of networking of disaffection, which is albeit, a small minority, but a feeding off, this general political and socioeconomic grievances that, the Russian security services fed into in 2016.
Yeah, so Fiona, there's another question along those lines from another attendee. Thanks for the book. Can you expand on the populist pitfalls that Russia the UK and the US could experience if hopes for new infrastructure of opportunity don't materialize? What are the stakes? And I would note for everybody here, I may be the only person who's read it on this call, but Fiona actually also wrote a book about the Russian version of coal country, and it's called The Siberian Curse, about the Russian far north. And there's a commonality there as well, places left behind in the sort of aftermath of the post-industrial era, if you will.
Well, the worst thing of all, as I suppose you're intimating in that question, is dashed expectations. And I think, that this is where we do have the rise of populism, going back to the previous question from Brian as well, is that when mainstream parties raise expectations that, yep, we're going to come in, we've got this very, elaborate program, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then, of course, they don't have the political capacity to do it. The wrangling that we have right now on Capitol Hill about the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill, where, there was all these ambitious plans and they're getting whittled down and whittled down and whittled down, even though we know that the majority of Americans actually would like quite a lot of the components of both of these bills to be implemented. When that kind of thing happens, people are kind of then, okay, you guys are doing nothing for us. So we had the same phenomenon in all three countries at different time sequences. As Susan knows only too well, in the 1990s in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was mass unemployment, and the Yeltsin government initiated a program of rapid reform, they hope, called shock therapy. And I write about this in the book. And it was a shock and not a lot of therapy. And it wasn't rapid. I mean, basically what happened as a result of all of their tinkering with the economy all at once is lots of people lost their jobs. They didn't have any social benefits to protect them. The people out on the streets, people literally starving. And the political parties and movements that formed around this became discredited, as did democracy itself. And so people were looking for a strong man like Vladimir Putin, who said he was going to fix it and make Russia great again, to come in. He didn't come in with really a political party. He came in of himself with his KGB pedigree and said he was going to basically turn things around. In the United Kingdom, the equivalent of the Democrats there, the Labour Party, had been in power in my area since the 1880s. Everybody was a member of the Labour Party. It was a shock if you weren't. And it wasn't just the Miners' Union and other unions that supported this. These were massive grassroots parties. Everybody was a Labour Party member. But the Labour Party was seen to do nothing. They weren't the party of power, and for a long period of time they were under Tony Blair. But there wasn't enough time really to kind of turn things around that had taken a generation or more to fester. And so there was great disaffection. There was a feeling that, well, Labour's done nothing for us. And they kept sending, bright young things with PhDs and, kind of backgrounds from the South as for somewhere else to be the Labour Party candidate in the safe seats. And they would go back to Westminster and, mostly play on the national stage, and people got frustrated. Sounds familiar, right? For the United States, where the Democratic Party, which was the bastion, the political bastion on all of these similar areas in the United States, seemed to be the party of the elites, the educated elites, and they seemed to kind of move away, and they had all these promises and these didn't come into fruition. So in both the United States and the United Kingdom, the Democrats and the Labour Party get discredited. The blue wall in the United States gets smashed down by Trump in 2016, and the red wall in the United Kingdom gets smashed down by Boris Johnson in 2019, but also starts to crumble and crack under Brexit in 2016. And so you have the same kind of phenomenon, everyone looking to someone else and to, kind of basically give them a chance. And I wouldn't say that, people are going to vote for populist leaders in perpetuity if they don't deliver anything, but Trump has been telling everyone, look, I didn't get the chance to deliver. And, kind of these people are still stealing away your jobs. These are still elites who, don't care about you, who don't speak to you, who don't understand your problems, but I do. And, it's that charismatic personality that kind of goes over the head of the party with all of their, wonkish policy programs and pronouncements that, I have some of those in my book because, it's kind of, what I do. But at the same time, kind of, you need to have people who have that personal experience to go out and talk to people about, kind of what needs to be done. So I'm basically trying to make an appeal in the book, in the memoir section and, some of the other observations, to have people to be connected so much more. I mean, the political parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, need to find genuine representation of people from the working, the middle class. They need to be able to reach over to people and to engage with them directly. And they need to tell the stories. People who are from my kind of background, who are out there from America, need to tell their stories as well, so people can connect and understand that, yeah, there are people like them out there. And, we have to kind of reach back and have to say and figure out how we can address their needs and work out programs that are responsive, not just promise them quick fixes.
So we're almost out of time, but we have a couple of great questions about Trump. You've talked about his sort of populist appeal. These are a little bit more specific. First of all, there's a question, how come you and others weren't able to brief Trump fully before Helsinki and actually, tell him what Putin was up to?
He didn't want to hear from us. In fact, the only briefing that he really got was from the president of Finland, who, we had a breakfast with, and thank God for the president of Finland. He managed to say a few things about, meeting with Vladimir Putin. In fact, the president of Finland has probably met with Putin more than anybody else.
That's right.
Kind of in Europe. And, because they've got that border, Finland used to be part of the Russian Empire. It's pretty top priority for them. And he had some pretty good insights. But, so he managed to do that, but Trump didn't want to hear from the staff. He just wanted to get in there, get on with it, and meet with Putin himself. And
so it wasn't like briefing for any normal summit. You didn't have the normal prep.
No, I mean, we had all the materials there, but, trying to get in and, get the time to go through this with him, he just was not interested.
Okay, so our last question, Deborah Morehouse from Columbia, Maryland. It's a little bit of a doozy, but I think you need to take it on. So Fiona, she wants to know, what's the deal? What's the bottom line with Donald Trump? Is he a sociopath? Is he lacking in the executive functions of the brain? Analysis, synthesis, anticipation? Is he dumb? Is he smart like a fox? How is it that this happened? And what's your bottom line takeaway here?
I think that Trump is a classic, charismatic character that we've kind of seen in history in other settings. I mean, it's pretty self-evident that he is a narcissist, that he has no ideology apart from idolatry and self-idolatry. I mean, we forgot Mary Trump, his niece's book, laying all of that out there. And I have a friend, many friends actually, who are psychologists, and said, look, the guy is a classic narcissist. But that narcissism, he's been able to translate it into this curious charm. He's very funny. He's very engaging. Everything is a performance. And this is why he's alluring for people, because people are projecting onto him. He's kind of like their avatar. He's kind of, in a way, what they want to be, because he's selling them himself. And what is himself? I mean, for those of us who are not quite in the same thrall that others seem to be, it's this story of the self-made guy. He wasn't self-made, of course, but that's the story, with the amazing, beautiful life and the true American dream in his view. In fact, he's the branding of the American dream, of buildings and houses and building everything, his own company. And, he is his own manager. He's his own boss. Nobody tells him what to do. And there's an awful lot of people in America who are so fed up of being told what to do and not having that kind of life, that they're kind of projecting onto Donald Trump, all the kind of their hopes and aspirations. And he's trying to sell them to him. He's selling you the lifestyle of the rich and famous.
Did you actually personally find him to be charming and engaging?
I found him at times, very funny. I could see that he was being very charming. He certainly didn't attempt to charm me. So, this is all just on observation, because he was, mostly not paying attention. Again, as he said in his note, he doesn't know who I am, or didn't know who I was. Although he seemed to have noticed my accent somewhere along the line. But I saw him, engaging with people directly. When he went into a crowd, he, fed off the energy of the crowd. We've seen other politicians do this. Bill Clinton did this, feed off the energy of the crowd, go in there and make the direct communication and engagement with them. And that's what I mean about that charisma, that allure that people have. And he wasn't an ordinary politician. He was a showman. He was a performance artist. This was a performance. And it's actually something, and interestingly, about Vladimir Putin. That's not his natural persona. But you and I, Susan, and many others who've covered Putin, that's what he does. I mean, think about all those crazy costumes that Putin has adopted at different points. He's done everything from flying an electrolyte, being a secret agent with his aviator sunglasses on, bare-chested, swimming across Siberian rivers. That's all about the performance, so that Putin can do the same, transform himself into something that other people want to be themselves, or they want him to be. So this is exactly the same thing that Trump's doing. He's a performer, a showman who's selling people things.
Well, I think it's a perfect note to end it on. We're back ending with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump together, which is how we started this conversation. And Fiona, thank you so much. I'm going to give it back to Brad now, but congratulations again on the book, which is There's Nothing for You Here.
Thanks so much, Susan.
Trump and Putin, what a pair. Great moderating, Susan, as always. And Fiona, for someone normally reticent to write about yourself, you've done an incredible job weaving your personal story in with a larger strategic one describing the parallels between Trump's White House and Putin's Kremlin and warning us about the social and economic disintegration in this country and where that could lead if not addressed more effectively. To everyone watching.
Yeah, Brad, I just wanted to say thanks before you cut us all off as well, and just say thanks to the audience too. And there's one little point that I just want to make based on what you just said there, that we all have to remember that we're all living in history. So everybody's biography, every single one of us, listening today is part of this, and everyone can also tell that same sort of story.
And if they do, and when they do, we'll be happy to sell it at P&P.
Exactly.
To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of There Is Nothing for You Here. From all of us here at Politics in Prose, stay well and well read.